this recording, I'm going to read excerpts from a writing by the title of No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, and this was written by a man named Lysander Spooner. He was born in 1808 and passed on in 1887. He was a lawyer, writer, entrepreneur, and activist. So this is just excerpts again from No Treason. If you'd like to read the entire document, you should have no trouble finding it freely available. These excerpts I found particularly important. They are pretty, bold. They could be jarring in that they are so contrary to what we're used to hearing about government and democracy. But I think it's in general valuable exercise to hear opinions and perspectives that differ from the norm. I found some of it very insightful, very enlightening, and just opened my eyes and my mind to some perspective that I had not heard before. So even though he was writing this some time ago, I find it's still extremely relevant. So with that said, I will now get into the reading. Okay, so the excerpt that I'm going to start with is Lysander talking about people paying taxes under the threat of arrest and imprisonment. So he's talking about the extortion of money from the public to state agents. So, all right, now to begin quoting Lysander Spooner in No Treason. To say, therefore, that by giving up his money to their agent, he entered into a voluntary contract with them, that he pledges himself to obey them, to support them, and to give them whatever money they should demand of him in the future, is simply ridiculous. All political power, so-called, rests practically upon this matter of money. Any number of scoundrels, having money enough to start with, can establish themselves as a, quote, government, because with money they can hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort more money, and also compel general obedience to their will. It is with government, as Caesar said it was in war, that money and soldiers mutually supported each other, that with money he could hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort money. So these villains, who call themselves governments, well understand that their power rests primarily upon money. With money they can hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort money. And when their authority is denied, the first use they always make of money is to hire soldiers to kill or subdue all who refuse them more money. For this reason, whoever desires liberty should understand these vital facts. Number one, that every man who puts money into the hands of a, quote, government, so-called, puts into his hands a sword, which will be used against him, to extort more money from him, and also to keep him in subjection to its arbitrary will. Number two, that those who will take his money without his consent in the first place will use it for his further robbery and enslavement, if he presumes to resist their demands in the future. Number three, that it is a perfect absurdity to suppose that any body of men who would ever take a man's money without his consent for any such object as they profess to take it for, that is, to protect him, for protecting him. For why should they wish to protect him if he does not wish them to do so? To suppose that they would do so is just as absurd as it would be to suppose that they would take his money without his consent for the purpose of buying food or clothing for him when he did not want it. My comment here, this was a particularly strong point, I thought, by Mr. Spooner, and so much so I think I will repeat it one more time, just to get across, how important it is. So, number 3 here, he said, "It is a perfect absurdity to suppose that any body of men would ever take a man's money without his consent for the object that they profess to take it, that of protecting him. For why should they wish to protect him if he does not wish them to do so? To suppose that they would do so is just as absurd as it would be to suppose that they would take his money without his consent for the purpose of buying food or clothing for him when he did not want it." Number 4. If a man wants protection, he is competent to make his own bargains for it, and nobody has any occasion to rob him in order to, quote, protect him against his will. That the only security men can have for their political liberty consists in their keeping their money in their own pockets until they have assurances, perfectly satisfactory to themselves, that it will be used as they wish it to be used, for their benefit and not for their injury. My comment here, this is another really important point, where he's talking about someone not paying someone for a service until they are assured that the service is going to be carried out in the manner that they want it to be carried out. In other words, that they trust the person that they're paying to do the right thing with their money. And the issue with taxation is that it's a form of extortion that basically forces you to trust, right? Or just ignores the relevance of whether you trust or not, right? Because you have no choice in the matter. It's just mandatory that you trust that the money is going to be used for purely good purposes, even though historically and up to this present day, there's countless examples of that not being the case. So you're being told that you need to pay for this service because the people that you're paying are unquestionably trustworthy, right? It's never said like that, in a campaign for, whatever office someone is trying to get elected into, or, that's never talked about usually in that manner in, say, political science class at a university. But that is really what's going on beneath the surface, right? You're being forced to trust, or you're being told that if you don't trust, there's something wrong with you. You're a bad person, a bad citizen. You're selfish, or you're crazy, or whatever. You're paranoid. That you should, of course, just trust these people to do the right thing with your money and to not abuse their positions of power, even though historically that's been the dominant trend. Okay, moving on now to number 6. That no government, so-called, can reasonably be trusted for a moment, or reasonably be supposed to have honest purposes in view, any longer than it depends wholly upon voluntary support. Okay, well, my comment, why is that the rational, intelligent position to give this automatic trust, when what they're asking for is non-voluntary support? If someone was asking you to help them in a voluntary manner for whatever good work that they wanted to do, like say someone's asking for funding for a garden project or something like that, people are going to either trust or not trust that the money will be used well, and they'll, donate accordingly. But if someone said you have to, pay me for my garden project, you have no choice about it, people would have less reason to trust, right? That the money was going to be used appropriately. Otherwise, why would they be doing something unethical for an ethical project, right? You're extorting money for the greater good. Right? You're trying to utilize evil to accomplish good, which doesn't actually work. Right? It's a karmic impossibility, I would say. Okay, continuing with Lysander Spooner. These facts are also vital and so self-evident that it cannot be reasonably supposed that anyone will voluntarily pay to a government for the purpose of securing its protection, unless he first makes an explicit and purely voluntary contract with it for that purpose. It is perfectly evident, therefore, that neither such voting nor such payment of taxes as actually takes place proves anybody's consent or obligation to support the Constitution. Consequently, we have no evidence at all that the Constitution is binding upon anybody, or that anybody is under any contract or obligation, whatever, to support it. And nobody is under any obligation to support it. My comment here, as an interesting aside, I actually just, I believe yesterday, looked into the phrase consent of the governed, because I had just asked someone for their opinion on what that actually means. What does that mean to have a government by the consent of the governed? Does that just mean that if you vote once every 4 years, you've given your consent? Or, what if the person you vote for loses? Then have you still given your consent? Or what if there's no candidate that you want to vote for? What if you don't want to support the system altogether? Where exactly and what exactly is this consent? And so on Wikipedia, there is a separate page titled Consent of the Governed. And I'll read from the beginning of it here. It says, in political philosophy, the phrase consent of the governed refers to the idea that a government's legitimacy and moral right to use state power is only justified and lawful when consented to by the people or society over which that political power is exercised. This theory of consent is historically contrasted to the divine right of kings. Then it goes on, and I have to say that, having read a little further, I haven't read the whole article yet, it's pretty convoluted. There's a lot of, I don't know, I can't think of the right word right now, just sort of nonsense. I'm, hesitant to use such a harsh word, but yeah, there's no clear explanation as far as I can see, no clear answer to this question. Oh, well, consent of the governed is this. There's a whole bunch of ideas on this page, and none of it is really striking me as completely reasonable, which returns us to No Treason by Lysander Spooner. And I will continue with the text now. The Constitution not only binds nobody now, but it never did bind anybody. It never bound anybody because it was never agreed to by anybody in such a manner as to make it, on general principles of law and reason, binding upon him. It is a general principle of law and reason that a written instrument binds no one until he has signed it. Moreover, this supposed contract, which would not be received in any court of justice sitting under its authority, if offered to prove a debt of $5 owing by one man to another, is one by which, as it is generally interpreted by those who pretend to administer it, all men, women, and children throughout the country and through all time surrender not only all their property, but also their liberties and even lives into the hands of men who, by this supposed contract, are expressly made wholly irresponsible for their disposal of them. And we are so insane or so wicked as to destroy property and lives without limit in fighting to compel men to fulfill a supposed contract which, in as much as it has never been signed by anybody, is, on general principles of law and reason, such principles as we are all governed by in regards to other contracts, the merest waste of paper, binding upon nobody, fit only to be thrown into the fire, or if preserved, preserved only to serve as a witness and a warning of the folly and wickedness of mankind. It is plain then that on general principles of law and reason, such principles as we all act upon in courts of justice and in common life, the Constitution is no contract, that it binds nobody and never did bind anybody, and that all those who pretend to act by its authority are really acting without any legitimate authority at all, that on general principles of law and reason, they are mere usurpers, and that everybody not only has the right, but is morally bound to treat them as such. If the people of this country wish to maintain such a government as the Constitution describes, there is no reason in the world why they should not sign the instrument itself, and thus make known their wishes in an open, authentic manner, in such manner as the common sense and experience of mankind have shown to be reasonable and necessary in such cases, and in such manner as to make themselves, as they ought to do, individually responsible for the acts of the government. But the people have never been asked to sign it, and the only reason why they have never been asked to sign it has been that it has been known that they never would sign it, that they were neither such fools nor knaves as they must needs have been to be willing to sign it, that, at least as it has been practically interpreted, it is not what any sensible and honest man wants for himself, nor such as he has any right to impose on others. It is, to all moral intents and purposes, as destitute of obligations as the compacts with robbers and thieves and pirates enter into with each other, but never sign. If any considerable number of the people believe the Constitution to be good, why do they not sign it themselves, and make laws for and administer them upon each other, leaving all other persons, who do not interfere with them, in peace? Until they have tried the experiment for themselves, how can they have the face to impose the Constitution upon, or even to recommend it to others? Plainly, the reason for absurd and inconsistent conduct is that they want the Constitution not solely for any honest or legitimate use it can be of to themselves or others, but for the dishonest and illegitimate power it gives them over the persons and properties of others. But for this latter reason, all their eulogiums on the Constitution, all their exhortations, and all their expenditures of money and blood to sustain it would be wanting. Thus it is obvious that the only visible, tangible government we have is made up of these professed agents or representatives of a secret band of robbers and murderers, who, to cover up or gloss over their robberies and murders, have taken to themselves the title of, quote, the people of the United States, end quote, and who, on the pretense of being, quote, the people of the United States, end quote, assert their right to subject to their dominion and to control and dispose of at their pleasure all property and persons found in the United States. The pretense that, quote, abolition of slavery, end quote, was either a motive or justification for the war is a fraud of the same character with that of, quote, maintaining the national honor. Who but usurpers, robbers, and murderers, as they have ever established slavery? Or what government, except one resting upon the sword, like the one we now have, was ever capable of maintaining slavery. And why did these men abolish slavery? Not from any love of liberty in general, not as an act of justice to the black man himself, but only as a war measure, and because they wanted his assistance and that of his friends in carrying on the war they had undertaken for maintaining and intensifying that political, commercial, and industrial slavery to which they have subjected the great body of the people, both black and white. And yet these impostors now cry out that they have abolished the chattel slavery of the black man, although that was not the motive of the war, as if they thought they could thereby conceal, atone for, or justify that other slavery which they were fighting to perpetuate, and to render more rigorous and inexorable than it was ever before. There was no difference of principle, but only of degree, between the slavery that they boast they have abolished and the slavery that they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon men's natural liberty, not necessary for the simple maintenance of justice, are of the nature of slavery, and differ from each other only in degree. If their object had really been to abolish slavery or maintain liberty or justice generally, they had only to say, all, whether white or black, who want the protection of this government shall have it, and all who do not want it will be left in peace, so long as they leave us in peace. Had they said this, slavery would necessarily have been abolished at once. The war would have been saved, and a thousand times nobler union than we have ever had would have been the result. It would have been a voluntary union of free men, such a union as will one day exist among all men the world over, if the several nations, so-called, shall ever get rid of the usurpers, robbers, and murderers called governments, that now plunder, enslave, and destroy them. Still another of the frauds of these men is that they are now establishing, and that the war was designed to establish, is the, quote, a government of consent, end quote. The only idea they have ever manifested as to what is a government of consent is this, that it is one to which everybody must consent or be shot. This idea was the dominant one on which the war was carried on, and it is the dominant one now that we have got what is called, quote, peace, end quote. Their pretenses that they have, quote, saved the country or, quote, preserved the glorious Union are frauds, like all the rest of their pretenses. By them they mean simply that they have subjugated and maintained their power over an unwilling people. This they call, quote, saving the country, as if an enslaved and subjugated people, or as if any people kept in subjection by the sword, as it is intended that all of us shall be hereafter, could be said to have any country. This too they call preserving our glorious Union, as if there could be said to be any union, glorious or inglorious, that was not voluntary, or as if there could be said to be any union between masters and slaves, between those who conquer and those who are subjugated. All these cries of having, quote, abolished slavery, end quote, or having saved the country, or having preserved the Union, of establishing a government of consent and of maintaining the national honor, are all gross, shameless, transparent cheats, so transparent that they ought to deceive no one, when uttered as justifications for the war, or for the government that has succeeded the war, or for now compelling the people to pay the cost of the war, or for compelling anybody to support a government that he does not want. The lesson taught by all of these facts is this: as long as mankind continues, as they are, such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long as this there will be enough to lend the money for those purposes, and with that money a plenty of tools, called soldiers, can be hired to keep them in subjection. But when they refuse any longer to pay for being thus cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, they will cease to have cheats usurpers and robbers and murderers and blood money loan mongers for masters.